It's my nerd world, and welcome to it. Thank you so much for checking the show out again this week. If it's your first time, welcome to my nerd world. Not a lot of news this week, but that doesn't mean we don't have things to talk about. Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland opened up. Now, this is a theme park. I hope to go one day. I do want to talk a little bit about it, especially what I've seen online and some of the responses so far on social media to Galaxy's Edge. I found a really interesting piece of audio from an interview done after The Last Jedi with Rian Johnson that I want to share with you. And it gets right to the heart of whether or not the sequel trilogy was or wasn't planned out. Now, I'm going to keep it positive because I know a lot of individuals use this idea of Lucasfilm and Disney not planning out this trilogy to try to criticize the new films. That is not the direction I'm going to go. However, the words of Rian Johnson in this old interview that I don't think a lot of people have heard really do, in my opinion, reveal what may have actually gone on in the creative process of this sequel trilogy. Also, I'm going to give my thoughts on the potential of a Knights of the Old Republic trilogy and why I think that's actually a fantastic idea after being lukewarm on the thought with the news that broke last week from BuzzFeed News that apparently a writer was already working on a script for that film. This week's show is brought to you by my science fiction space opera novel, Embark. This week, I'm trying to do something, and I need some help in doing this. Selling books is difficult. So about the midway point through the podcast, I have a special request for you listening, and then we'll get into it a little bit more at the end of the show. So that'll be the sponsorship portion of the show. I'm sponsoring myself in selling my books and continuing to work on the sequels, and that's kind of what this is all about and what I'm trying to accomplish this weekend, but I can't do it unless I have your help. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into it.
We've passed on all we know. 1,000 generations live in you now. But this is your fight. We'll always be with you. No one's ever really gone.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you?
I'm no one. There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
My nerd world.
Just let it in.
I know I say this a lot, but I love Star Wars. It just brings me so much flippin' joy. It's just, I just do. And that opening, every once in a while, man, depending on where my headspace is, and I'm kind of in a very sort of emotional headspace. I'm usually in an emotional headspace as it is, but every once in a while, when I go to do the show and I hear the second part, sort of the main intro, apart from the Rise of Skywalker intro, and that riff on that theme, you know, there were stories about what happened, and it guts me every single time. Thank you so much for checking the show out this week. I can't thank you enough for the kind comments that you leave for me and that you email for the show. And I so look forward to coming here and being able to talk about Star Wars for 45 to 90 minutes each week, even when there isn't a ton of news, which is one of those weeks. But I came across something fascinating on my ride now that the weather has finally turned a corner and, summer and spring has finally arrived here in Minnesota. I can go for a bike ride. And I started listening to some older interviews and going back and revisiting some of the interviews post The Last Jedi, just because I was in the mood. And I unearthed, this is an interview I'd heard before, but I unearthed some comments from Rian Johnson. I was like, we need to go and talk about this. Talk about this in the show. So that'll be a little bit later on in the show. And as I mentioned earlier about my science fiction book, Embark, what I'm trying to do this weekend, and I'll get into this in the middle portion of the show this week, and then again cap it at the end. But you can choose categories on Amazon.com for your book to be placed in, based on the subject matter. And depending on what categories you choose, you can be higher up in the rankings if you have a specific category. So my goal this weekend is with the young adult science fiction space opera category, which is a category. And while my book is not wasn't necessarily written to be young adult, it is clean. It is good for any age. I've had my 12-year-old and his friends, 11-year-olds, that have really enjoyed it, up to 60-year-olds enjoy the book. And that's what I really wanted to do when I crafted this story. But this weekend, I'm trying to go number one in that category. But the only way I can do that is off of sales. So I've dumped the price again to 99 cents, which gives me 35 cents of royalty. So this is not about the money by any stretch of the imagination. But if I can get it to go number one this weekend, I can grab screenshots of that. And then when I go to promote the sequel books, which will be out very soon, then I can add to the promotion of that, hey, number one best-selling series, Embark by Jon Justice. So again, we'll get into that a little bit more later on in the show. And it's the way that you can support the show. If you like what you hear during this podcast, go and purchase my science fiction space opera book. So let's start here first, and I'm not going to get into the specifics completely, but I will toss this out here real quick.
The hyperdrive is leaking.
My ridiculous talking about leaked info sounder, which
the hyperdrive is leaking.
No, I can't change it, right? Because I've used it too much. There was a rumor that came out, and this is not going to be spoilers for those that don't want to be spoiled, because thankfully it's been debunked. But there was a rumor that came out that Rey's parents were basically Han Solo, who at some point in time had cheated on Leia, and that Rey was really Han Solo's daughter from a previous relationship. Thankfully, and I'll make it real brief, that's been debunked. Pablo Hidalgo, who is a part of the Lucasfilm Story Group, the group of individuals that the content creators and the makers of the film and the writers powwow with to craft the larger saga to keep everything in canon. He came out and said it doesn't fit with the timeline of Leia and Han. And the bigger takeaway for me from an individual like that, an official with Lucasfilm coming out and being and making a comment like that, is that they don't want this rumor to get any further because it's bogus. MakingStarWars.net has a great track record, and Jason Ward was the one who put it out there on his Patreon portion of his podcast, and even he said that it was a rumor. But this thing spread like wildfire. The thread on Reddit had almost 2,000 comments, and almost all of them unanimously said they hated the idea, and I hated the idea as well. So thankfully, this idea that Rey is Han's child from a previous relationship, not with Leia, has all but been debunked, and I'm thankful that I can share that with you on the show, because I also thought it was pretty ridiculous. That being said, I kind of go back to, and I'm personally hoping for her to be Rey Nobody. That what Rian Johnson did in The Last Jedi is pretty true to who Rey is. Now, I know that J.J. Abrams did go and say that most likely he would be, not most likely, he would be. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. J.J. Abrams said that there was more to Rey's parentage story that would be told in The Rise of Skywalker, but that he also wouldn't be betraying what Rian Johnson did in The Last Jedi. And we'll get into a little bit more of that when I play you this 3 minutes of audio from this interview that Rian Johnson did with director Spike Jonze. And this was a part of the Directors Guild podcast. They do a podcast called The Director's Cut, and it's directors interviewing directors. And this was done early in 2018 after the 2017 release of The Last Jedi, and there's some really interesting comments that, again, Rian Johnson made, so we'll share that with you a little bit later on. So now that we've got the news debunked portion of it, let's move over to Galaxy's Edge for just a moment, and I want to talk a little bit about the fandom, but I just kind of want to get something off my chest, and I'll mention what that is in a moment. But Galaxy's Edge in California at Disneyland did open up this weekend. It opened up on Friday. Really cool to see in the opening ceremonies earlier in the week. I believe it was on Thursday. Bob Iger was there at Disneyland and Galaxy's Edge, and so was George Lucas. So was Billy D. Williams, Harrison Ford, and Mark Hamill. And it really was, if you've been online and if you haven't seen this yet, you can go onto YouTube. A bunch of people have put up clips. There's a lot of photos out there of that group of individuals at night at Galaxy's Edge, doing a little opening ceremony, press conference, and photos. And it just was really, really cool to see. It's unfortunate with, of course, the passing a couple years back of Carrie Fisher, and then the recent passing of Peter Mayhew, who played Chewbacca. It's bittersweet that they weren't there, but it was really cool to see, as this lifelong fan of the series, to see the creator George Lucas there with Lando, Han, and Luke. That just was really, really special, and it kind of drew me in to see what was happening with Galaxy's Edge. Look, I'm excited about Galaxy's Edge, but it is a theme park. And so, especially with the show, I like to focus on stuff as it relates to the stories. And with Galaxy's Edge, I know we've got some books, and I know that within the current timeline of the sequel trilogy, the story of Galaxy's Edge is falling into that window. But, I've kind of just been like, well, that's cool, but I'm not really clamoring for any Galaxy's Edge news. It was really neat to see. And if you're looking for something to sort of Star Wars-y to wipe out on this weekend that's not one of the films, I would encourage you to go to YouTube and check out some of the Disney aficionado videos that have gone up. Individuals who post a lot of stuff about Disney that have Disney YouTube channels, Disneyland YouTube channels, who were able to get into Galaxy's Edge over the course of these past few days to see their walkthrough videos and see what they've created there. I was watching with my wife Melinda yesterday. One individual was walking through the moment it opened on Friday and stepping into Galaxy's Edge and seeing the Millennium Falcon there, and the fact that they position the Millennium Falcon when you walk into Galaxy's Edge so that when you walk in, it's almost at the exact angle as you saw the Millennium Falcon in A New Hope originally. And I'll be honest, watching the video of people at Galaxy's Edge, I almost started to tear up. I told my wife, "Oh man, I'm gonna bawl like a baby when I end up being able to go to Galaxy's Edge, hopefully next year for Celebration." It just looks absolutely fantastic, and I love how immersive it is. I love what Disney did in not. It doesn't have the same sort of feel and vibe that like Star Tours does. Like Star Tours is great. I love Star Tours. I love the original version. I love the updated version. It's great. But with Star Tours, it is just a ride in and of itself. And I know it's got an immersive quality into when you get into it, but it doesn't have that fully immersive quality, especially because it's positioned over in Tomorrowland, so it's more of just a ride. It's clear that this was something unique and different, and when they set out to make Galaxy's Edge, they really did set it out to make it like the other themed areas of the park. And I know I've seen some people complaining about the intellectual property and the theming of Disneyland and how it's changed, and it's not as good as it used to be. And look, and to each their own on their opinions. I disagree. I love what they're doing, and Disney in and of itself was always kind of an intellectual property, and I grew up in the parks. I grew up in Southern California. As a kid, we would go every single year, and then when I got into my 20s and moved out on my own during what I call doing that thing with my fingers, the dark years, I had an annual pass, and I was going to Disneyland a couple times a week. And those themed lands in Disneyland were those were intellectual properties to me. They were, when you go to Adventureland and Fantasyland. In my mind, I don't really separate that out from a Star Wars themed land. That's kind of the same thing. And so when they made the films based off the attractions, I was down with that. I thought that was cool. I'm looking forward to the Jungle Book movie, and I'm one of the few that enjoys all the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. And the fact that they took Star Wars and Galaxy's Edge and did exactly the same thing as they've done before and made it really immersive, I think was a bold move and a brave move to have it themed in a particular time period. And this is what I wanted to talk about just briefly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I do want to keep the show, and I will always keep the show positive. But I've seen some people that have already, and this is Twitter, and this is not the majority in my opinion, and if you disagree, that's fine, but that's just my opinion. Having done the research on Twitter, and I've talked about this on the show, of knowing the people that use Twitter and who use YouTube versus the demographics and the number of people who are online that don't use those social networking, those available social networks. In my opinion, just based off my research, it's not the majority. It's a loud group of individuals, but it's not representative of the larger Star Wars fandom specifically as a whole. But I've already seen people complaining there's no Star Wars in Star Wars, in Star Wars land. There's no Star Wars in Galaxy's Edge. And the complaints are stemming from this idea that there isn't original trilogy stuff in Galaxy's Edge, and so it's missing the core of what Star Wars is. And that's fine if that's your opinion. And it really seems to be there is a portion of the fandom that are just sort of strict original trilogy individuals, and that to them is Star Wars. And if that's what Star Wars is to you, fantastic. I personally think what Disney is doing with Galaxy's Edge is the smart move. And I think it's what's best for the genre and for Star Wars moving forward, because they've got to bring in a new audience. They've got to build on that. They need the sequel trilogy to be to a new generation of individuals what the original trilogy was for a guy like me. Now, I happen to also love the prequels, and I also love these sequel movies. And I think based off of my expectation, let's just say for the sake of argument that The Rise of Skywalker is a really, really good film, maybe even a great film. If it turns out that's the case, and I believe it's going to be, at least really good, if not great, then the sequel trilogy for me has the potential to be my favorite trilogy. It's not to say I love the original trilogy any less, right? Or the prequels. It is just to say if somebody goes and asks me, hey, if you had any choice of a Star Wars trilogy to watch of the three, which one would you do? I would potentially, depending on how The Rise of Skywalker turns out, go, it's the sequel trilogy. Just based off of how much I love The Force Awakens and definitely The Last Jedi. So I understand what Disney is doing with Galaxy's Edge. And I get why people are frustrated because they would want to see references to Darth Vader or more original trilogy stuff in a land that's supposed to be dedicated to Star Wars, and this is taking place within the sequel trilogy era. But I think that Disney knows, if they want this franchise to survive, and that's what I want, at least for the length of my lifetime and my children's lifetime, this is what they are going to have to do. Right? And it is just a theme park, but they're going out of their way to make sure that it's an extension of the larger mythos with the books and stuff attached to it. I think they're going to have a lot of success, despite the fact that you can argue, and I would even agree, that there has been some hiccups with Disney's attempt to make these side stories, right? I do think that Disney's trying to find their footing on what they are going to do with the sequel trilogy, which is why we went from potentially having even as many as 2 films a year to having to wait 3 years before we get the next set of films after The Rise of Skywalker. I think this is Disney sort of course-correcting, figuring out what's the best way to keep this franchise alive, and from a theatrical standpoint, they're going to try something different. Even though, in my opinion, they've been very successful so far, despite the box office returns for Solo not being what they were supposed to be. So if you take your eyes off of what they're doing on the theatrical creative content part of it and look at what they're doing on the ancillary stuff, I think that everything that they've done with the books, with the comic books, with the graphic novels, and even with the theme park is the right thing to do to make sure that the fandom remains strong for generations to come. Especially when you look at, and I've talked about this before, the cartoons for kids, right? Resistance, or even the Galaxy of Adventures, Forces of Destiny. This is what Disney's goal is, and I think they're really, really good at that. So I guess I would hope that people who were complaining would see that, but there's just some people that want to complain for the sake of complaining. And that's the one thing that I wanted to mention, and then we'll move on, sort of the negative part of it. And this is cathartic for me. I want to get this sort of out of my system, and that's what I use the show for as well. But I'll just say for the record, I am so tired of the negativity. It's amazing to me. That's not the right word. It's sad. It's sad to me the number of shows that I'm used to listening to, because I love listening to Star Wars podcasts, that I've unfortunately had to turn off as of late because there's just so much negativity, and I guess I don't get that. I can't relate to it because I wouldn't be doing the show if I didn't like Star Wars, or if I was frustrated with what was going on. That's not fun for me, right? I love this franchise too much that I can't relate to somebody who would want to go and do a weekly show, but then go on that show and just complain about all the things they don't like. But that's why I have the power just to go ahead and turn it off. So I just wanted to vent for a moment, because there was a couple of shows that I was listening to, and I was like, oh, why are they being negative? You guys usually have really great commentary, and for some reason, there's a bunch of negativity all of a sudden, and I don't get it. But, hey, they still got my download. They're just not getting my listens. Okay, so let's go here. And then we'll get into this Rian Johnson audio, and then your listener feedback this week, which is going to be the bulk of the show.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
So I was listening to the Jedi Council Collider podcast this week. I don't particularly care for Rule of Two all that much. I won't get into the reasons why, but that's one of the ones that I don't listen to very often. I like half that show, but the other half ruins it for me, so I can't listen to it. But Jedi Collider, I was listening to it this week, and Christian Harlock's kind of hit or miss. I like Ken Knapsack quite a bit, but Christian Harloff and the group over at Jedi Council were talking about the Knights of the Old Republic, and I mentioned this last week, that apparently a script was being written for Knights of the Old Republic. And this was according to BuzzFeed News. And like I talked about last week, there's a lot of stuff in development. So who knows how much credibility there is to that particular news story, or how far along or not along they are, and whether or not this is actually going to come to fruition. But anyways, Christian Harloff was talking about this. And I played those Knights of the Old Republic games years ago. And in the middle of hearing his commentary and how excited he was for the potential of a Knights of the Old Republic series, I kind of had this little light bulb moment that said, you know what? That's actually a really good idea. And this is apart from Benioff and Weiss, right? This is not because the guys that potentially could be doing it, for the sake of argument, let's say that Benioff and Weiss were going to be doing a Knights of the Old Republic trilogy, and that's the movies, and those are the movies that we're going to be getting in 2022, starting in 2022. Let's just set that aside, that they would be the ones doing it, and we'll just say for the sake of argument that is a trilogy we're going to be getting at some point in time. I think it really is a good idea. And the reason I think it's a good idea, and this is what was the little light bulb moment, because my mind usually doesn't go there when it comes to Star Wars content, but when we're talking about the potential future of the franchise and how do we keep it alive, what stories do we tell, I'm super excited for the idea of going to a brand new place and meeting new characters in a part of the galaxy we haven't seen before, right? That's all fresh and new, and that was the original intent, at least that's what we were told, of what Rian Johnson was going to be doing. We don't know if that's the case now. We still know that he's involved with Lucasfilm. We just don't know where his films and his input is going to be placed now. That idea got me really excited. However, the idea of going to a place that we've never been before with brand new characters, and let's say it's parallel or ahead of the timeline of the sequel trilogy, I think that's a difficult sell for Disney and for Lucasfilm. that's tough to get the fandom excited in the way that we get excited now whenever we get a piece of the Rise of Skywalker material, right? We know this mythology. We know these characters. We have backgrounds on these characters, so we can go and send comments and emails and listen to shows where we can go and extrapolate and try to figure out, hey, what's going to happen? Have discussions, speculate on what could potentially happen based off of prior knowledge. If you're doing that with a brand new set of characters in a place we've never been before, that's difficult. You're at a place where when those first trailers run, you're going to be looking at it almost as if it's like a brand new science fiction franchise, because there's not going to be a whole lot to speculate on, because we're not going to have a ton of information about those characters, if any. Okay, so that's a harder sell to get everybody excited until you get the storyline rolling and you get the first movie out of the way. This is why I think Knights of the Old Republic could be really, really good, especially if Lucasfilm decides that they are actually going to say, hey, this will be based off of the storyline from the video game with changes. Okay? Not everybody played those video games. So the older fans like me that did know the storyline in the original Knights of the Old Republic game. And I tend to agree with Christian Harloff that they should just stick with the first Knights of the Old Republic and not the second story, because the first story, there's enough in there for a trilogy in and of itself. But they can also do, and they have done this a little bit, but in doing Knights of the Old Republic, if it's based off of the storyline in the video game, they can do what's worked so well within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where when you see the first trailer for Knights of the Old Republic, for those of us who played the game, then we can start the speculation game again. Much in the same way that comic book fans of the Marvel superheroes are able to look at a trailer for a Marvel Cinematic Universe film and go, ooh, that looks like it's taken from blank, or that looks like it's taken from this particular series. And DC has done this as well. That's where I think the potential for a Knights of the Old Republic could work really, really well in getting the fandom excited. Because then fans like me, fans like you that have played the game, other hosts to other shows that have played the game, can bring along the new generation of, hey, if you didn't play the game, here's the deal. What we saw in the trailer could be this from the video game. Now, Disney and Lucasfilm has already done this to a certain extent. They have picked and pulled from the what is now Legends and Expanded Universe and brought that into the mix. I don't think it's worked as well so far as it's worked for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, just because of that vocal part of the fandom, especially that part of the fandom that is still very frustrated that all their beloved Expanded Universe stuff wasn't turned into canon when Lucasfilm took over the franchise. I don't think that Lucasfilm gets enough credit for pulling from the Expanded Universe into the new canon. I think they could do that more and maybe bring about some more goodwill among those Expanded Universe, now Legends fans that would have liked to have seen the Thrawn trilogy come to fruition, or Shadows of the Empire. I think if they pulled a little bit more from that, especially when it comes to the cinematic films, right? Because they really haven't done that when it comes to the sequel trilogy basically at all. It's kind of been reserved for shows like Rebels. And Rebels was the one that they really kind of pulled from. Dave Filoni pulled a lot from the Expanded Universe, now Legends. And perhaps in Mandalorian we'll get something similar. We already know that the Mandalorian himself is loosely based off of, even though this isn't the most popular thing in the world, is loosely based off of the introduction of Boba Fett in the holiday special in that cartoon. But that's where, again, I think the strength of a Knights of the Old Republic series could really gain from, is letting the fandom know, hey, we're going to base it off the video game, okay? We're going to make some changes, but, you know, this is where our starting point is. Plus, I personally would like to see that. Well, if I had my choice, I want to move forward in the timeline of what we know so far, going back to the Knights of the Old Republic and getting back into Jedi and older Sith lore, especially if it's kind of based off of, I know Knights of the Old Republic from a technological standpoint wasn't really all that far removed from what we were used to seeing in the films. And I've heard some people say they need to reverse engineer that to make it a little bit older. I love the look of Knights of the Old Republic. So I think that it could really benefit and bring in the fandom by having it kind of match that and not be too far removed from what we're seeing on the screen. But I would be excited to see that. I would be excited to see something fresh and new. And you can do relatively new characters along with these characters that aren't necessarily canon. I mean, I guess Revan's kind of canon. But I was not excited at first when I heard about this possibility of doing a Knights of the Old Republic. And it wasn't, again, until I heard that Jedi Council, their discussion around it. I went, you know what? That could really, really work well. I'm not convinced that that's what this particular script or this BuzzFeed news story is pointing to. Just wanted to take a moment and discuss it and also get your thoughts. So when you write me on YouTube or email me, talkshownerd at gmail.com, let me know what you think. Does that get you excited at all? Especially if you're a newer fan and not familiar with Knights of the Old Republic. So let's just say that you never played the video game and you don't know a whole lot about that portion of the storytelling. I'm curious if anything or any of what I've mentioned so far, or any little bit that you know about the events that took place prior to the Phantom Menace, gets you excited in the least bit. Talkshownerd at gmail.com, or again, drop a comment on YouTube.
My Nerd World.
All right, I want to take just a moment and remind you that if you haven't purchased my science fiction and space opera novel, Embark, this weekend I've lowered the price again. The paperback is at its lowest price possible at $11.99. The ebook is only 99 cents. And if you purchase the ebook for 99 cents, you can actually get the audiobook produced and narrated by me for $7.50. I think it's reduced right now if you are an Amazon customer for $14. My goal this weekend, though, is to hit number one in my young adult science fiction space opera category. And this is something that Amazon lets you do. You can pick the categories. It's kind of like if your book was going to be placed in a bookstore, what categories would you place it under? And so I've got my book categorized. I've got the categories in a number of different places for my book. There's a bit of techno-thriller in there. It's action-adventure. It's obviously sci-fi. Dystopian, based off of what happens to Earth in the book. Apocalyptic, to a certain extent. So these are all various categories that I have the book under. But I have it also placed in the young adult category because it is a good read, in my opinion, for the young and the old, like I mentioned at the start of the show. And I've hit like top 30 in that category before with just a handful of sales. So what I decided was, because we're in the middle of editing the second book, which will be out here in the next couple of months, my wife Melinda is doing a fantastic job, and the beta reader's response to Embark, Treasure in Darkness Book 2 has been absolutely fantastic, so I'm super excited to get it out there. While that's going on, I'm working on the audiobook for that in the middle of the editing process, and I've already started writing book 3, and I hope to actually have that out before the end of the year. So it'll be a quick back-to-back release of the second books in this trilogy. But what I'd like to do is when those second books come out, I want to be able to go and say, hey, this is a number one best-selling series when I go to promote the entire trilogy. And the only way I can do that is if I hit number one in one of these categories. And that young adult space opera science fiction category is the one that I can do it in. So if you haven't purchased the book yet, please, if you want to support the show, go to Amazon.com, search for Jon Justice, and you can pick the version that you like. If you have a friend who's a science fiction fan and you think they would enjoy this book, please buy it for them and help me hit number one this weekend. I really, really would appreciate it. If you've already purchased it, as always, thank you so much. And when and if you've read it, and if you've enjoyed it, go and leave a comment up on Amazon.com. I really, really would appreciate it. At the end of the show, I'll run the little ad that I put together for those that aren't familiar with what the story is about. Right now, let's get back into the show.
There has been an awakening. Have you felt it?
So, been going out on my bike rides again because the weather finally turned a corner here in Minnesota. I love going for my daily rides, and I love listening to podcasts. I decided to go back and listen to some old Rian Johnson interviews. When I was writing Embark, it was right around pre pre and post release for The Last Jedi, along with like Ready Player One, right into that area. And Rian Johnson was a real inspiration for me in writing this story. And not in terms of the storytelling itself, but just in terms of the person himself. I really like him as a person and his creative process. So I went back and I wanted to hear some old interviews that I hadn't listened to since The Last Jedi came out. And there was a really good one where it was the Directors Guild. And they do this directors, they call it the Director's Cut, and it's directors interviewing directors. And if you're into the creative process and filmmakers, it really is a great podcast. It's usually about 45 minutes, and they do the interview portion, and then sometimes they let the audience go and ask questions. And this was a fantastic interview between Spike Jonze and Rian Johnson. But you know that there's a lot of controversy around whether or not the sequel trilogy was planned out. Right? And a lot of people say, it wasn't planned out, and this is the problem that I have with it. And a lot of that comes down to the criticism. I don't have that problem particularly myself, and I'll explain why. However, I thought this was really interesting. In the middle of this interview, this was shortly after, this was, just a couple of months, if not like a month after The Last Jedi came out when this interview was done. And for those that have followed the promotional process after The Last Jedi came out, you probably know Rian Johnson did a ton of interviews and really didn't hold back on his opinion and answering people's questions. This part of the interview I thought was really fascinating when it comes to whether or not this sequel trilogy was planned out. I've seen a lot of individuals go and post evidence of comments made by Rian Johnson, but also Kathleen Kennedy and J.J. Abrams specifically, that would lend some credibility to the fact that they did have a rough outline. Adam Driver has said that he's known the arc of his character since the beginning. So I'll get into a little bit of how I think these comments from Rian Johnson fit in with those comments. But for me, this is one of the most revealing moments of whether or not this sequel trilogy was planned out from the start or not. And I say it's the most revealing because this interview was very candid. And if you listen to Rian Johnson's response, I don't see any hesitation here. He seems very authentic and genuine when answering these questions from Spike Jonze. So here you go.
And how did you decide how did you make it your own? How did you sort of take from it what take from it and still leave room for yourself to make it your own?
Yeah, it was that. I mean, that coming into it, that was a big question because this is, it is what it being what it is, and the fact that it's, Disney, and it's, my first studio movie that I was coming into. That was kind of the big question on my mind. Was what is this going to be? Is this going to be a big machine that is going to swallow me? And it was one of the really pleasant, surprises of this whole thing that it really wasn't that. That it was. Kathy Kennedy and also, all the folks at Disney, they really understood that, like, the original movies were incredibly personal movies for Lucas, and that's why they're alive. That's why they have, a soul. And so when I came into it, first of all, there wasn't like any kind of like secret whiteboard with the whole story laid out. It was really just, I read JJ's and Michael and Larry's script for 7, and it was just what happens next.
They hadn't sketched out the next two movies at all.
No. Really? This was more like a baton handoff, and that led to. And first of all, that seemed crazy to me coming into it. I was like, wow, really? And then as I got into it and started working, it was like, oh, thank God, because it meant that we could, as opposed to just tagging bases, it meant that we could, or that I could, honestly react to what I felt from The Force Awakens and those characters and find a path forward for them that, I don't know, that felt honest to me, that felt real, and that led to some surprising places we might not have gone to if the whole thing was drawn out.
And when you eventually did talk to J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan, and did they have things in mind that they had were setting up or pointing in directions or things?
They had nothing they dictated to me. No, they were really gracious in kind of leaving it open.
This is we took it up to the moment that movie ended,
and so, for example, the question of like Rey's parentage, which was like a big question in this. I never got like the remember in Clue, you had the packet of things as so-and-so in the library. I never got the equivalent of that for all the answers in this movie.
Yeah.
But the wonderful thing about that was that meant that I was able then to just come up with the answer that was best suited to the dramatic necessities of this story. And the fact that this is Rey's quest for identity, and the fact that this is the middle chapter where we've got to throw the hardest stuff we can at her, I was able then to say, okay, so what is the hardest answer she could get? And the hardest answer is, you're not going to get the easy answer of you're so-and-so's daughter or whatever it is. You're going to have to stand on your own 2 feet and define yourself in this story. So I'm very thankful it was set up that way.
My nerd world.
I want you, if you can, just to take a moment and give me your instinctive reaction to what you just heard. I really want to be able to get into this on next week's show. So drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or if you're listening on YouTube, leave a comment on YouTube and let me know what it is what do you think of those comments made by Rian Johnson? Okay, I really, really am curious. Okay, so here's the deal from my perspective. That seemed really, really genuine to me. Okay. What I think most likely took place here is I imagine that J.J. Abrams and Kathleen Kennedy, when they sat down to go and craft, and going back to Michael Arndt, who was originally part of the story process, along with Lawrence Kasdan, I think they did have kind of an arc of where they wanted the characters to go and what the potential was, and I think there is truth. I don't think that they were lying when they said that, like Adam Driver, right, says, I know where my character was going from the get-go. When Kathleen Kennedy says, that we had the idea for Palpatine from the start. Those are all things in the background that can all still be true and fit into what Rian Johnson said there of he was really just handed a baton and told what to go and do. That doesn't necessarily conflict, in my opinion. Okay, let's say for the sake of argument that it does. Let's say for the sake of argument that there really was no plan. Maybe J.J. Abrams had his own idea of what the trajectory was going to be. Maybe he told Adam Driver that. Maybe Adam Driver simply made that comment of he knew where his character was going based off of what J.J. Abrams told him, but what Rian Johnson did also fit into that arc as well, right? Here's the thing for me. Even if it wasn't planned out at all, I'm totally fine with that. I have no issue with the fact that they decided from a creative standpoint that they were going to let these writers and directors be the ones to dictate where this story goes. Now, that's also based off the fact, and I know that depending on what your view of the films are, may have the possibility to go and taint your view of that. If you don't like The Last Jedi, then I can certainly see how you could use the comments of Rian Johnson and say, well, therein lies the problem. He wasn't given any direction, so he went wherever he wanted to go, and I don't particularly like where he went. For somebody that thinks The Last Jedi is a masterpiece, I love the creative path that they ended up taking. I am what they call pantser, right? Flying by the seat of my pants. There are two types of writers. There's plotters, those who plot things out, and there's pantsers. There are those that just have the story in mind of where they want to go, and then they just write. And it's pure inspiration as they craft the story. That's what I do. I've got a rough idea in my head of where my stories are going. I had that idea when I came up with the storyline for my Embark trilogy. I knew what was going to happen in the beginning. I had kind of a rough idea of what was going to happen in the middle, and in the end, I didn't plot all this out on paper, though. I just write and craft the story, and I think that Rian Johnson is very much the same way. And I love the fact that that's why we got, in my opinion, The Last Jedi the way that we did. Was Rian Johnson created a story that he wanted to create that was meaningful to him. In that interview, and you didn't hear it in the audio, but he talks about just what a joy it was and how easy the story came to him when he was creating it, and what a big fan he was as a kid of Star Wars, and how he wanted, just like J.J. Abrams did, wanted to do something that was fun and delightful and meaningful, and one of these characters to go through these difficulties to help grow them. To me, that's why The Last Jedi is a piece of art, and why, in my opinion, it's going to be revered in years to come, apart from the other films, as being, one of the best Star Wars movies next to, like, The Empire Strikes Back. I just thought that was really fascinating. And I'm totally fine if they do that. And I can't help but wonder if they did that, if they didn't really give them much guidance. And I can't help but wonder if that was the problem with Colin Trevorrow's script treatment, is that they did something similar to him. And Rian Johnson mentions that in the handing off of the baton back to J.J. Abrams, that he had a conversation with J.J., but he really just handed it over to him. And now J.J. was working off of, and we know his comments have been that, he's building off of what Rian Johnson did, and he felt inspired by what Rian Johnson did and taking risks, and decided to do, The Rise of Skywalker much the same way. But I can't help but wonder if with Colin Trevorrow, the issue was that what Colin Trevorrow ended up presenting didn't really work as a finale. And that's the hard part too, right? You got to close this whole thing out, and it can't just be the end of a trilogy and the story continues. This is the end of the Skywalker story, so it's got to work. And I can't help but wonder if what Colin Trevorrow presented to Lucasfilm they looked at it and went, nah, man, this is not going to work. So what do you think? What do you think about what Rian Johnson said about being handed this and wasn't given any direction, and there was no whiteboard with an outline on it? Do you think that's what really happened, or do you think there was something loose in the background based off what you heard before? I really, really want to hear from you, and we'll get into all that on next week's episode here on My Nerd World, the Star Wars podcast.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
I do this like every week. I say, you know what, I'm just going to do a 45-minute show this week. Not a lot of news, we'll just do some commentary, and then I'll do some listener feedback, and then I look at the clock and it's 45 minutes in and I haven't started listener feedback yet. So it ends up being a hour-and-a-half show. I usually hear about this when I'm done from Melinda, because she usually goes, I thought you were going to do a short show this week. And I go, yeah, that didn't happen. I'm talking Star Wars. How can that happen? All right, let's get into it, though. Across the Stars writes this. Rian Johnson tweeted pictures of a red thread during The Last Jedi filming. It was pretty cool. I think Rey and Ben will have the most epic love story in Star Wars. I can't wait to see how it plays out. Keeping with the idea that I am keeping an open mind to whatever J.J. Abrams decides to do with Rey and Ben. I really do love that emotional connection. That goes without saying, right? Call it Reylo, call it what you want to quote Taylor Swift. Yeah, that just happened. I just quoted Taylor Swift. Call it what you want to. That's such an emotional connection for that movie. What Rian Johnson did with Ben and being able to sort of inject your own view of what Ben Solo was going through with Rey and the difficulties and the struggles, I can really relate and gravitate towards that. Again, relate to it from a real world versus Star Wars aspect. All right, Kelly Langley says this. To me, The Last Jedi was the hardest of the three to tackle, and Rian Johnson captured it perfectly. These two characters started off hating one another. Well, Rey hated him. Kylo was fixated. But take them from being opposites to equals in The Last Jedi was epic. Coming into The Rise of Skywalker, with that much tension between them, it needs to go deeper and evolve. And I believe we're actually going to get that. I'm adding that part. Yes, there is still conflict between them, but now there is so much romantic tensions. Their likeness of isolation and the feeling along that brings them together. They are balanced, yin and yang, and when they are together, they work harmoniously, and it's beautiful to watch. I'm completely down for them to be in love and together and work together to bring closure we need after all the chaos that the Skywalker family has been through. Thank you, Kelly. Sky Draffic, friend of the show, writes this. In response to the guy from Vanity Fair who was giving his thoughts on what he'd learned about the Rise of Skywalker, said this. That guy in the audio, he basically knows more than we do, knows no more than we do, and simply repeats all kinds of theories that are out there to spark discussions. Yeah, and I tend to agree. He was throwing some stuff out there like the Richard E. Grant character being Hux's dad, and that's already been taken care of in canon and stuff like that. But thank you, as always, Sky Drathic, for the kind words, too. I really do appreciate it. Malcolm writes this. Hey, John, I love your takes and opinions on Star Wars, especially as it relates to the new trilogy. Thank you very much. I, like yourself, caught on to Reylo, and I didn't see it at all in The Force Awakens, but in retrospect, as I look at the articles and interviews before TFA came out, as J.J. Abrams quotes from an interview he did with Slash when he was asked what his approach for doing his first film in the sequel trilogy, he stated, doing that thing with my fingers, we tried looking at it from the inside out. What makes it romantic, funny, heartbreaking? We look at it from the perspective that this is a story of a young man and a young woman not just doing anything we want. On The Ellen Show, Daisy Ridley, John Boyega, Oscar Isaac were all on there, and Ellen flat out asked, will there be romance? And Oscar said, there is a romance, but you have to watch it a few times to get it because it's subtle. So, will these two walk off into the sunset at the end of The Rise of Skywalker? Who knows? But there is something deeply profound and beautiful about their dynamic, which is amazing. Oh, and FYI, I watched The Last Jedi 11 times, and that was just in theaters. Nicely done, Malcolm. Yeah, nicely done. Man after my own heart. Here's a bold statement, especially for Reylos. But if Disney, if J.J. Abrams specifically and Chris Terrio do go the route of bringing a romantic conclusion, bringing romance into the conclusion of the Skywalker saga between Rey and Ben Solo, it will tick off a lot of people. There's no doubt about that, right? I think we all know. We can all see the YouTube headlines we won't be able to avoid because the algorithms will thrust them into our recommends. You know that to be true. That being said, if they do bring a romantic element into the end of the story of Skywalker, right, and the rise of Skywalker, while it will make a very, in my opinion, please don't argue, just my opinion, a very small but vocal part of the fandom really, really mad, it's going to solidify a lot of fans for a long time to come. Girls with sabers, I'm talking to you ladies. And I mean that with nothing but respect. It really will do a lot to bring this to a close, make a big portion of the fandom super happy, and I think go a long way to securing future generations to Star Wars in a way that Luke Skywalker did. It's risky, I'm not going to lie, because there's going to be definitely be a portion of the fandom that's not going to be pleased about it. But the risk versus the reward, I think the reward would be huge for Lucasfilm and for Star Wars movies going forward. To end on something strong, but also potentially divisive. Because those fans that really wanted to see that, right? I'd really like to see that. I know that a lot of you listening would really like to see that, making sure that it's done properly. I think that really could go a long way. Now, you can close it out. You can leave it ambiguous. You can leave it nuanced. Redeem Ben Solo. Allude potentially to a romance, kind of like what Rian Johnson did, and that's a little bit safer, right? You have the potential to not make the Reylo portion of the fandom mad and to kind of appease that other portion that isn't into Reylo. Okay, and that's fine. And if I were a betting man, that's probably the route they're going to go. But if you want to go the route of really cementing some strong opinions and love for the franchise, I think that going the riskier route's the way to go. And what I'm arguing is kind of more the route that Rian Johnson went. I know a lot of people will probably disagree with me on that, but that's just my opinion. Okay. Misconduct One writes this, and this is in response to a controversial, with my fingers again, email that she presented last week, talking about her frustrations with the end of Game of Thrones, which were obviously shared by many. It's cool, John. I respect that you loved it, the end of Game of Thrones. Thanks for everything. I would have really been okay with her turn to the dark side, being Daenerys, spoiler alert, if they had shown some conflict with the character. They get into, Misconduct gets into some other comments about Game of Thrones. And I don't want to spend time on it because this is a Star Wars podcast, but they do wrap up with this. I appreciate you recognizing my personal feelings about it. You're the best. Thank you so much. And I really hope, look, man, I'm so glad that you shared them with me. And that's the way that I appreciate And that's the way I think we should talk to one another, right? Not, like, I had somebody comment on there, oh, Reylo, Last Jedi, you like those? I'm out. Like, they put that in the comments. It's like, why bother? Just don't comment at all. I appreciate it when we can have a talk and be like, look, I disagree, but I respect that we disagree. And, you know, art's that way. Art is subjective. So let's treat it as such when we talk about it with one another. And Misconduct One and I do that, and I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for the comments, and we are all entitled to your opinion, and I absolutely respect yours. SJs writes this. I did hear a rumor the new planet, Pisana, has a red river. Not sure where I heard that. That would be cool. I would like something to be unique. Black-Eyed Lily writes this. Can't believe you read my entire lengthy email. You certainly made my day. Well, you made my day for writing it. And I promise to follow up on the other topic that I mentioned. I'm glad to see you touching on the red string of fate, and I see that other people have already mentioned that Rian Johnson also alluded to this. He shared 2 tweets while working on The Last Jedi that were simply pictures of red spools of thread. Nice. And ever diligent and observant Reylo community picked up on this and started sharing information with this Chinese folklore. I'm curious where you picked up on this. I don't think you mentioned it. I saw somebody bring it up on YouTube, just randomly. Somebody was commenting on a Reylo thread and then mentioned the red thread of fate, and I'd never heard of it before. I must have missed it in the Reylo discussion early on and did my own research. So I was happy to see that this had been covered ground, and I was kind of late to the party on that. So that's where I ended up finding out about it, and I'm glad that I did. Shlomo, friend of the show out of Israel, says this. I figured it out. Rey and Kylo merge into a single being. The one on the floor on Octo. Okay, maybe not. It might just be the painkillers in my broken tooth. They fulfill the prophecy of bringing balance to the Force. Yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see if that gets played with, or that was just something that Rian Johnson did. I do think that obviously Ben and Rey are going to be the ones to bring balance to the Force. I just don't know if I don't see them merging into that either. And I think Shlomo was being a little glib there. But I do absolutely see Ben and Rey are the ones that are going to bring balance to the Force finally to wrap up this entire saga. SJ's writes again, by the way, the Vanity Fair article, it specifically says JJ was continuing what Rian did and had already planned to do so because that's where most of the story was going to end. Rian, if anything, chose how they got there. Tend to agree. Shock Fitness wrote this. John, I enjoy your takes on the pod, man. Your show is insightful, well thought out. Keep up the good work. You have a fan here in Los Angeles. Oh, I miss Los Angeles. I was born and raised in Southern California. Arcadia, Monrovia, Santa Ana. I miss it there. Thank you so much, Shock Fitness. I really do appreciate it. Let's see. Baffled and Deranged writes this. Vanity Fair photos are awesome. It makes sense that Rian Johnson is still working on a Star Wars trilogy due to the fact that he's gotten special access to the Visit Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. That's good, as I'm looking forward to seeing more of his work, too. And that's right. Things happen for a reason. Sometimes many in our lives, good and bad. Nope. My feelings are the Force bond was already there between Kylo and Rey. Snoke knew this and turned green with envy and decided to mess with Kylo's internal conflicts and took credit for the Force bond. Yeah, you know what? And I haven't really landed on anything. I tend to think that. I like the idea that in The Force Awakens, kind of where my headcanon goes until I'm told differently, I kind of like the idea in The Force Awakens that when Kylo Ren initially makes that connection in the interrogation, and on the commentary, J.J. Abrams talks about how he wrestled with how long that scene was going to be because it was kind of a lengthy shot with nothing going on. And I think the Force sound effects in the background of that interrogation scene really do help out in the moment. But I tend to, my headcanon goes to, that's when the connection was made. And maybe even Kylo did it and couldn't let go. Like, I got into this girl's head. I like what I saw. I'm already compelled to her. Rey didn't push back. She pushed back hard in the moment, but didn't completely shut it off because she, too, felt something. And therefore, that's when the connection was kind of forged, and they've kept with it ever since. JJ writes this. Discovered this channel a few weeks ago. Now I find myself waiting for it. I love your love for all things Star Wars. Very insightful podcast. Thanks. Thank you, JJ. Really do appreciate it. Tracy writes, I wonder now if Matt Smith is or isn't in the movie, especially when you consider the Making Star Wars .net ending spoilers. If he isn't, then those spoilers could very well be completely wrong. True. Or if he is in it, then maybe they are trying to cover up his real role. I think they're trying to cover up his real role, whatever it is. That's my call. I think he is in the film. Noob Games writes this. Can you please read Master and Apprentice and talk about the prophecy? Thanks. You know what? I'll handle that on next week's show. I won't have time to read Master and Apprentice between now and then, but I will get into that prophecy that's laid out in Master and Apprentice and give you my thoughts on next week's show. Bizuki 777. Hi, John. I bought the Last Jedi comics as soon as they came out. I really enjoyed them. I have quite a collection of Last Jedi goodies now. I'm surprised you've only just heard about Red Thread. I think the girls with sabers and Jedi Jade have spoken about it. Also, Joanna Robinson of Vanity Fair said there is a clever hidden meeting in the two front covers on the Vanity Fair of Kylo and Rey. Has anyone discovered it? I'm really curious as to what it is in the new pick of Rey and Kylo with their lightsabers in the rain. I could be wrong. I don't think they're fighting each other. I think he's looking at her, but she is facing a different direction. Yeah, I tend to think that photo that was made for the Vanity Fair of the two of them fighting on what everybody believes, and I agree, is the Death Star 2, is a bit of a misdirection. What I've seen people talk about with the connection on the Vanity Fair cover was, I think Kylo's background was the sun setting and the clouds on Rey's side were the sun rising. And some people said that it looked like they were actually occupying the same space. At least that's what... I didn't really see anybody land on anything that made me go, that's it! So if you did, please write in, as you always do. Either leave it on YouTube or talkshownerd at gmail.com. All right, let's get to our next comment. And let's go to the intro maker says this. Hello, great cast. I love it. I also think The Last Jedi is the greatest Star Wars movie ever, and you must know that I am a huge fan of the 80s. People love it or hate it, but without exception, they did have an opinion on it, and it provoked it. For me, that's the real success of a movie. About the current trilogy, I heart the male theme of it in the opening scene of TFA. I think it was worded poorly, but talking about Lord Santeco when he said, this should start to make things right. It's all about making things right in the galaxy. Yeah, tend to agree. Friend of the show, Athea, writes this. Glad you brought up the Red Thread of Fate. Rian Johnson has posted images of the Red Thread on Twitter, right? Adam Driver has repeatedly said that there was a direction and a plan from the beginning, right? And he mentions the connection between Rey and Ben goes deeper than we have seen, leads me to believe that this connection is romantic love and that this will allow them to do things with the Force that we have not seen before in canon. I'm hoping for it to be all-out romance in 9. You know, and to add a little fuel to that fire, right? And again, I'm keeping an open mind on whatever J.J. Abrams does. But that comment about J.J. Abrams being inspired by Rian Johnson and what he did with his film, when it comes to him doing The Rise of Skywalker, what if that comment was directly related to, I like what he did. He kind of took what I did with Ben and Rey and The Force Awakens and really expanded upon it. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to go full on to that in The Rise of Skywalker. Just throwing that out there. Amparo writes this. Hello, friend. The Red Thread was actually talked about early on by a lot of Reylos. The shot of them in the rain fighting is interesting and reminds me of a lot of people's theories about their final battle, like the one being between Anakin and Obi-Wan on Mustafar, surrounded by fire. I cannot help to think that this is some meaning to it, or maybe it's just maybe it's just JJ thinking it looks rad. I think it looks rad. I dig it. Thank you, Amparo. I appreciate it. Let's go here. Mary writes, I've believed for a while that the cosmic force has been trying to reintegrate dark and light to bring balance and perhaps completion. The Jedi eschewed the aspects of the association with the dark side completely. Yep. And the Sith considered the aspects of the light to be weakness. Consequently, both Jedi and Sith were unbalanced. Hence, the cosmic force is constantly trying to restore the balance. Darkness rises in the light to meet it and vice versa. That's why Rey is endowed by the cosmic force with equal strength to Ben. They are meant to balance each other out, to combine their aspects and work together to bring balance. But we shall see. Can't wait for December 20th. Aaron writes, how do you think the final battle will play out? Do you think the Vanity Fair shot of Kylo Ren and Rey is from the final battle? I do. Heard the rumors of the underwater battle. I think it's a cool concept to have a battle surrounded by water, seeing as the duel from Revenge of the Sith was surrounded by lava. Love listening to the podcast. Thanks. Yeah, the final battle and how it's going to play out is, I don't have a ton of speculation on that beyond the spoilers that we talked about a couple of weeks back. I have heard about the wire work potentially being done for an underwater battle. There was talk of a zero-G battle. I think it's probably more likely there's some kind of underwater battle. And based off of that one shot alone, which is all we have to go off of, and that pin, that sort of lapel pin artwork that showed the two of them, the silhouettes of Rey and Kylo Ren facing off with water behind them. Yeah, I think that, especially on that shot, if they're fighting on the Death Star and it's as broken up as it is, and it's as tumultuous as that shot looks, if I use that word correctly and pronounced it correctly, if I didn't, I apologize. I think there's a good chance they could fall into the water and be battling against whomever it is that they're fighting against if they are facing off against a third party, which I believe that they are. Thank you very much for the comment. Agnes writes this, a friend of the show. Recently, I've been leaning towards the theory that Kylo/Ben is a double agent kind of character. Yeah, I kind of dig this too. Not strictly a double agent, but someone who plays his own game against the dark side. And when it is revealed, he will be redeemed. Because even killing Han Solo will make sense. Kylo says, "I will finish what you started," to his grandfather. And now we know that Vader started getting rid of Palpatine, but he did not succeed 100%. So Ben wants to do it. And probably the only way to start on this journey was to learn about the dark side, so he had to associate himself with Snoke and prove his worth by killing Han. Cheers, Agnes. I like this idea. I really, really do. It takes some fleshing out. I haven't worked it out myself because I'm too busy using what little gray matter that I have to focus on the writing of my own stories. But I do like this idea that potentially all along there was Kylo Ren, Ben, struggling with the dark side, but he was trying to solve this himself. And he's been thrown off by the connection that he had with Rey and discovering Rey, was waiting for the lightness to rise to try to bring balance and end it whatsoever, but he got thrown for a loop because here's this girl in front of him that he can't help but feel a much deeper connection to in a way that he didn't expect. So that's real kind of surface level spitballing. That's the pantser in me right there, is saying that, show me again, I feel it again, the pull to the light, show me the darkness, I'll finish what you started. That could be, and we'll end here, that little comment that he makes to Vader's helmet could be one of, Vader was trying to bring balance to the dark side and didn't pull it off in his redemption, right? So he is trying to stay balanced himself. He wants to finish what started, but he also knows that he has to stay on the dark side if he's going to go in and do that. And again, I know that doesn't completely work. I'm just riffing here, but I do like that thought, and thank you, as always, for the comment, Agnes. I really do appreciate it. Hey, and that wraps it up. I got it in under an hour and 20. So there you go. I was trying to make it shorter. I made it a little bit shorter than I normally do. Thank you, as always, for checking out the show. Again, and I'll run the ad here in just a second. If you purchased my science fiction space opera novel, which was written because I wanted to create my own universe, and I was inspired by the Star Wars content creators, starting with George Lucas all the way over to Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams. If you purchased the book, thank you very much. If you haven't, stick around. And you don't know much about it, stick around after the outro here, and I'll do one more quick plug and let you in on what the story about Embark is all about. For everybody else, thank you so much for checking the show out. Thank you for helping me push my book to #1 this weekend in that selected category. If you want to support the show, that's the way to do it. Purchase the ebook, the audiobook, or the paperback this weekend for you or a friend. I really would appreciate it. And I'm just thankful for you checking the show out at all. We'll be back again next week, and now here is Obi-Wan Kenobi to take us out.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.
Thank you so much for sticking around till after the show is done. For those that are new to the show, a number of years ago, I had an idea for the story, for a story. I'm a talk show host. I have been for 24 years. And I've been doing this show, the Star Wars show, now for a couple years, and decided about 3 years ago to challenge myself to see if I could go and write a novel. My wife loves to read. I am not a big reader. I write stories for people who love movies. If you aren't a big reader, but have read on occasion, but you love movies more, I would encourage you to check out my first book in this trilogy called Embark. I'll run the ad for it here in just a moment. And again, I write books for people that love movies. That's what I'm visualizing when I write my stories. I was able to wrap up this book and have it released in November of last year, and it turned out to be an experience a lot more meaningful than I ever expected. My initial goal was just to write one story, and now I enjoy it so much, and I love the feeling so much of writing these science fiction space opera stories that I'm going to complete my trilogy, which hopefully will be out in its entirety by the first of next year, if not the end of this year. The second book, Treasure in Darkness, will be released here in a couple of months. I'm currently in the editing process of that with my wife and recording the audio book. But this weekend, I'm hoping to push, again, Embark to the #1 category, the first book in the series. And so go pick it up on Amazon.com. You can also get the audiobook on Audible. It's also on Amazon, and the paperback. And for those that don't know what the story is about, here's a little goofy 1-minute ad that I produced on the fly for it. For Earth, the end is near. Only a reluctant hero and the girl he loves have the power to save humanity's future. It's the not-so-distant future, and car culture is replaced by air and space flight, made possible by two of Earth's largest corporations. Flight mechanic Taft Guardia spends his free time racing through the skies with his 3 best friends and the girl he longs to be with, headstrong KOTOR. With the planet on the brink of an industrial apocalypse, a powerful and ruthless corporate madman, Sint Argum, moves to exploit the disaster with his covertly created military. When Taft, Katha, and their friends uncover a shocking secret, Sint Argum will stop at nothing to find them. Time on Earth is running out, but with the help of a ragtag group of young pilots, they'll fight for humanity's future and survival among the stars.
My Nerd World.
And just so, for those that haven't read the book yet, just a couple of notes. The first portion of the book, it is heavy on setting the stage, right? This is my first novel, so it's not without its flaws. The first portion of the book, and most people who have read it I think will agree with this. There's a lot of, not a lot, but the first portion of the book is the setup and the exposition to kind of let you know the world that we live in here in a future Earth. Okay, and then when you get into the middle portion of the book, that's when it really takes off. There is no overt political theme. I did not go into this book for any sort of political theme whatsoever. I really wanted to do my best to capture the spirit of what George Lucas did with Star Wars, where it's good versus evil. Straight up, it's good versus evil, and romance in a realistic way set in this. It's science fantasy. Okay, it is future on Earth. You can't, in my opinion, it's really tough to do anything apart from Earth-based future science fiction because it just ends up becoming too close to what George Lucas did. No aliens. This is all human, good versus evil, and the struggle that people have to, dealing with wanting to grasp power from the bad guy. So, all right, there's my hit. There's my pitch. Whatever you want to call it. Go purchase the book if you haven't done it already. Help me hit #1 in that category this weekend if you want to go and support the show. If you've already purchased it, as always, thank you. Buy a copy for your friend. It's only $1. I get 35 cents off of it, so it's not about the money. I just want to be able to promote the upcoming books and be able to say, I have a #1 selling series, and that's what I can do if I hit #1 in this category with a handful of sales. All right, that's it. I'm out of here. I'll be back next week. Thank you so much for the support. Bye.
There has been an awakening. Have you felt it?